Hey friends, it's Brian Foreman at the Campbell University Center for Church and Community, and I am so excited to have my friend Mark Sampson with us. Mark is the co-founder of Rooted Good, and he's going to tell you a little bit about that during the course of our conversation. But first, we're going to start the conversation by what we do all the time, Mark, and that's tell us what's good.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, thank you. It's great to be talking with you. Thanks for inviting me onto this little thing you've created. I really appreciate that. So what's good? Fantastic question for a difficult year. So I was reflecting on this before coming on this call, and I was thinking about this year and the nature of life in a sort of pandemic and what that's meant sort of organizationally, sort of personally, in terms of my faith and my life and my sort of friendships. And I think one of the things that's consistent for all of us in this is that we've been way more sedentary than we've been in other times. And I think there's aspects of that I found deeply frustrating. I've missed time with people. I've missed traveling to different places. I've missed working face to face. I've missed all of that kind of eating with people, the whole of that gamut of a human experience, which is so meaningful. But there's something about recognizing in new ways that we live somewhere, which I think is an amazing gift of 2020, that even if we are in, I used to live in central London, even if we're in New York or in San Francisco, even under the concrete somewhere, there's going to be soil. And that soil is particular soil. It's a particular place, and it has a history and a memory, and it has an identity. So I think there's something that's good that this year reminds us, is that we are in a place and we're connected to the ground, we're connected to our environment, to a certain context, and that there's something in that is refreshing us about what it means to be human. And that can be a painful journey. It can be the realization that we've never really ever thought that we were somewhere. We've tried to be everywhere. It can be painful because there can be pain associated with where we are. There can be injustice. There can be injustice actually etched into the geography of our location. There can be inequity all around us. But in the midst of all of that, there's also something profound, some gift there of the soil, and a recognizing that our humanity, our faith, our expression of what it means to sort of be human is intrinsically connected to places. It's not abstract, it's not separate from our context, but it's embedded within our context. So I've moved to America this year, which has been, you could say that's good. It's been interesting, for sure. That's a very British way of talking about problems.
Right.
It's been interesting.
Tell folks the timing of your move to America.
Yeah, I moved at the beginning of March. And so it was kind of just before I couldn't actually, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, my wife's from Michigan. So we moved to Michigan with our 3 kids. And we actually I moved from London onto 14 acres of woods in Michigan. And I think the gift of this year, what's good for this year has been just walking on that land, chopping trees down, planting trees, getting the ground ready for planting next spring, and building a tree house with my son, but just finding a deep connection to the soil, to the place, and realizing that there's a gift here, there's a memory here, and there's a calling here. And the question is, what does this mean, right? What does this mean for my life? What does this mean for my family's life, for my community? This deep connection here. So I'm intrigued about that. I'm intrigued about a kind of, what some people call a theology of place, of a kind of, what does it mean to be sort of rooted and placed in a certain community? I just spent the last 10 years living in a community in London that was very intentional about living life together and stuff. And so very much the extracting from that was very painful, but also partly it's painful because it just means a lot, right? It matters where you are and who you're with. And so I'm excited about that for this next chapter. That for me, at a very personal level, feels what's good right now.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting year to in some fascinatingly timed things that have happened that were all set in place before COVID-19 hit. But Tim Soren's with the Parish Collective releases this book early on in the pandemic called Everywhere You Look, and it's talking about the very thing of a theology of place. And he's talking about this idea of the neighborhood being the parish, and that the soil having a story, all the very same things you're talking about. Then you guys found Rooted Good, and this I mean, it's almost like you planned it, right? um, to be talking about theology of place when your whole life has been uprooted and replanted somewhere else. But yet, even where you're planted, there are significant roots there for your wife's family.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, I think we're only just beginning to unpack the significance that we called this organization we started Rooted Good, and it implies that there's a different kind of good when it's a rooted good, when it's a connected good. I've been intrigued recently, and it's very much connected with what's good about, and I know Tim Soren's is as well with that book, about how the journey of our understanding of trees and forests and roots has dramatically shifted in the last 30 years. And it kind of gives us a bit of a picture for how our imagination needs to shift at lots of levels. So very quickly, if I may, I was kind of geeking out for 5 minutes or 3 minutes. Let's do 3 minutes on trees. So we used to think, right, that trees, individual trees competed against each other for nutrients, for water, and for sunlight. And so each tree would try and grow faster, have a bigger crown, where its leaves go out, and get deeper roots because it's in competition. Because it's in competition, it's like, I need to get the most I can to grow strong, to bear fruit, and to be resilient as a tree. That all changed 30 years ago when a forest scientist called Susan Simard in British Columbia did a study, and she essentially trapped some carbon through some radioactive carbon in a fir tree, and then tested a nearby birch tree and found the same carbon there. And that led to a series of experiments realizing, oh my goodness, trees aren't in competition with each other. They're actually collaborating. They actually deliberately, intentionally, remarkably share nutrients, carbon and nitrogen particularly, to other trees, that they talk through their roots, and particularly through these kind of fungal web-like systems, which some scientists call the World Wood Web, which I quite like that.
Nice.
And they basically pass information and nutrients to each other. So forests are resilient, not because trees are in competition, but because trees collaborate. And they're deeply connected. There are mother trees that deliberately, intentionally resource smaller trees. There are different species talk to each other. They warn if any sort of dangerous insects are in the neighborhood. They let off certain smells, and they're all doing all of this all the time as a collaborative, connected ecosystem. And I think in some ways, man, that is the picture of how we need to think about ourselves. It's how we need to think about our organizations. Particularly, I think it's how we need to reboot our kind of economic imagination, where we've just bought this myth that competition between people leads to the best outcomes. But I'm just not sure that's always true. So that's trees.
Yeah, okay, so in the course of talking about trees, you talked about being connected and rooted. You talked about ecosystems, and you just talked about economic collaboration and a different economic system. So let me use that as a way for us to transition to talking about what are some of the things that you all are doing that cause you to read an article about trees and think about how we can learn from them.
Yeah, so thank you, Brian. So at Rooted Good, we're passionate about helping people make more of a difference in the world. And we do that through training, through learning experiences, and through designing tools. So one of the things we're excited about is actually a collaboration with Brian and his team at the moment around Make Good, which is an accelerator course. What's good? Make Good, right? Is an accelerator course for social entrepreneurs. So how do you help social entrepreneurs go from an initial idea to being ready to launch their initiative or organization? So we're partnering with organizations like Campbell to help train more and more young people, and, well, any age actually, in sort of social entrepreneurship. So that excites me. We've also recently started a project which we just launched our application for, called the Oikos Accelerator. And this is where we're working specifically with congregations that have property. And we're working with congregations to help them think through how can they creatively use their property and buildings in ways to both further their mission creatively in their communities, but also generate some income. It's really interesting, exciting project. We're going to basically be helping 50 congregations across the US, really try and figure out, okay, how do we reimagine our own economic future as a congregation, but in doing so, be more of a blessing, be more of a gift to our local community. So yeah, if anyone's out there listening, wants to get interested, please look it up, and you can apply right now for that. That'd be fun. We've got all sorts of other fun stuff we're going on as well, but those are the two that sort of, yeah, come to mind.
So, since this could be archived on the internet, and you were talking about applications and due dates, when are the applications due for that?
So applications are open now. So it's the 9th of December, 2020, and they will be rolling. So you can apply anytime up until probably March 2021, and it will kick off around about March, but you can actually start later on. It's going to be mostly an online learning experience with a sort of gathering at the end. So yeah. Thank you.
When we post this, we'll make sure to put the link to your organization and as well as to the application. We'll make sure that that's there so that folks can find it as well also.
Thank you, Brian.
Now, you guys are also doing some work around faith and finance. Any thoughts in that area?
Yeah, so this is, yeah, so I'm really intrigued by this question of the relationship between theology and economics. I spent a long time doing a doctorate on this. Brian and I have talked about this in our friendship many times. It's this question of, we know that there's problems with our economy right now. There's deep inequality. There's inequity that seems to be rooted into our system as opposed to like just a byproduct of that system. Mm-hmm. And the question of what is our economic future seems to be everywhere. You know, at one level, 2020 has been a health crisis, but at one level, it's also been an economic crisis as well. And even that is fascinating. I'm convinced that the one of the problems is in our imagination about what the economy is and how we best sort of operate within that and what it's for. You know, what is it for? What is the purpose behind business? What's the purpose behind markets? What's the purpose behind all of our economic activity? And I think the Christian tradition has a huge amount to say to that. And for some reason, we've been blind to the clear economic embodiment of Christianity. We've assumed it has very little to say. We've been embarrassed to say anything at all. But I think there's resources within the Christian tradition for a different imagination about the economy, for particularly answering these questions of what is this all for? I'm really intrigued about that at an organizational level. So how do you help organizations articulate and have a sort of conviction around what they exist for and what they think money and the kind of making of money and the creation of, you know, of value, what that is for and how that can serve basically a greater good than simply profit. So yeah, all of that is stuff that we've and that overlaps with a lot of the work we do at Rooted Good. My colleague Mark Elston's got a book coming out middle of next year called We Aren't Broke, which is looking at this question of, particularly for churches and non-profits, this question of sort of money and mission and how they might be creatively aligned in new ways. I actually have a book coming out as well at some point next year, which is a much nerdier exploration of sort of theology and economics, which I do not recommend unless you are struggling to sleep.
I suspect there will be much wisdom to be gained from that. Hey, so I'm going to throw a theory at you just to respond to, because I've not actually tossed it out at anybody else, and it seems like now's a good time to do that. So sorry, maybe. I had this thought that I think part of our issue is that we have somehow, as a culture, bought into this idea that it is a zero sum. Everything is a zero sum game. So if if this group is given more access to money, that means somebody else is going to have less money. Or if this group gets more access to healthcare, this group is going to lose access to health. Um, and I think that can be applied to so many ways that we do life and church.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think it leads us to be pretty sinful in the perspective from to get theology nerd, right? From the perspective of how we see our neighbor as threat, as opposed to child of God.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm putting you on the spot with that, and that's not really fair to do, but because I've been tossing this around in my head, but it's like this idea of where did we come up with a zero-sum game?
Yeah, I think you're on it, and I think that is an intriguing question. I think we basically, and interesting, I think the significance and the role of economics in sort of culture and society as a discipline, right, as a way of thinking, I think largely accounts for some of this. So economics, modern mainstream economics, as it's understood, basically presumes the conditions of scarcity for its study, right? It's basically this assumption that there simply is not enough around. And so the question of then what you do with that is an intriguing question, and how you understand how resources should be allocated and distributed and so on within economics. Now, of course, economists, when they use that word, they don't really mean scarcity in the sense that we're talking about it, this kind of bigger sort of metaphysical level. But in many ways, it ends up being like that. So you end up seeing everything as a kind of scarce resource. And if something is scarce, then the question is, I need to get more of that. And I need to be anxious about that. I need to be nervous about that, because if somebody else gets it, I won't have it. And I think that way of thinking doesn't just affect our economic activity, so how we think about collaboration and partnerships, how we think about business and intellectual property and so on, but it also affects our relationships, right? And our understanding of church and faith, and even, I think, our understanding of God. And we get locked into these sort of zero-sum ways of thinking, which is rooted in this real scarce understanding of the world. And I think when we think of the creation being scarce, I think what we do is we actually come up with a very different narrative than Genesis 1, Genesis 2, right? We come up with a very different creation story, because what we get from those creation poems, right, in Genesis, is a world that isn't scarce, where there's actually abundance, when there's actually enough, when there's sort of, one of the older sort of theological terms is like plenitude. There's this kind of there's this abundance around us. And I think when you have that creation story, then actually sharing, collaborating, partnering, giving, like going without even, right? They all become responses to the world, as opposed to what we tend to do in our cultural default is to respond with a scarce, competitive, zero-sum mindset, which leads to so much anxiety. Oh my goodness. Like the levels of anxiety, I think, in our culture right now are just astonishing. And that's probably the more lasting pandemic, right?
Right. Yeah, I think what's fascinating about that is that the example you gave is an Old Testament one. There's nowhere in the New Testament that anybody talks about abundance.
Maybe, well, apart from like all of it, yeah.
Yeah, I think I remember Jesus saying something about I've come to give you life abundantly. But I'm a practitioner. I'm not necessarily a theologian, so I probably need to go back and get my concordance out to make sure that I've remembered that correctly. Mark, you guys are doing amazing work to spread abundance and to help churches think about the abundance of their assets and the way that they can build community and create a better social network, even like the forests have, in the way that the trees communicate. And there's so much that we can learn from that. So I am excited about the work that you guys are doing. I'm excited about our ability to partner with you all and what that will look like for congregations in our orbit as well. But mostly I'm just excited about your friendship and the good work that you, Shannon, and the other Mark are doing to bring some of this joy and abundance to our world. So again, I will make sure that we have all the ways to connect with you on the website posted along with this. Any final wise words of parting?
Hey, this has been fun. We've gone from like trees to economics to abundance. I think that is the hallmark of a good conversation for sure. I enjoyed it.
And in like under 20 minutes. So how about that?
Amazing.
All right. Well, I'm gonna hit stop recording here as we tell everyone goodbye, and we'll just keep talking. So I'm just trying to make everyone jealous at this point. So, but Mark, I look forward to opportunities for people to hear more from you, particularly as the pandemic lifts and when we can get you back to North Carolina.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Brian.
All right. Take care.